Hi everyone, we're group 13 and in this presentation, I'll be talking about academic literacy. Jessie will be talking about transnational literacy and Tana will be talking about policy and literacy and Stella will be talking about multimodality. First, I'll be talking about academic literacy. Since primary school, I have traveled between Australia and China, experiencing 3 different types of education systems. This includes the Chinese, Australian, and International Baccalaureate. In this presentation, I will outline my language learning trajectory from a culturally situated perspective to illustrate different types of academic literacy. Despite the context, the English literacy curriculum is often based on pedagogies informed by studies from Anglo societies and periphery countries such as United States, Canada, Australia, or Britain. For example, despite the location of the school which I have attended in the past, they often use material from the literary canon. While texts such as the Shakespeare may be confusing or irrelevant to many non-Anglo background students, nevertheless, minorities' culture texts are rarely incorporated in the curriculum. This reflects an unequal balance of power in education. From a socio-culturally perspective, academic literacy is hugely diverse in different contexts. In China, literacy learning focuses on skill-based approach because of the Confucian heritage culture which emphasizes on silent learning and memorization. Teachers believe it is more proficient and effective if a student practices fundamental skills in silence. On the other hand, in Australia, literacy learning is much more dynamic. Language socialization approaches are often used where students are working in groups and in pairs to construct new knowledge and skills. Ultimately, when I studied in an international school, as the students were from a large range of cultural backgrounds, the academic literacy shifted towards a cross-cultural understanding. Literacy text used in international schools draws on a range of diverse cultures, rather than merely focusing on the idealized predominant literary canon. Personally, English learning has supported me to reshape my identity in various ways. My initial identity was a student who tried to pass a subject. Then after moving to Australia, I shifted to an outsider who attempts to fit into the dominant culture. Finally, now, I'm a bilingual teacher who can use both of my languages to support my students to learn and find their own identities. Years ago, I was often ashamed of my accent and non-native speaker identity, as I have witnessed many injustices in recruitment systems where jobs in China directly stated they want white people for the job. Luckily, as Gretel suggested, the world is witnessing a decline of native speaker. Nevertheless, as I have gained more confidence and expanded my horizon in language learning and teaching, I took ownership of my multilingual identity and acknowledged there isn't a hierarchical way of an English speaker. Instead, people just use different variations of English. Finally, I believe literate identities are fluid. Every person is consistently reshaping their literate identity as our world and context changes. As educators, we must acknowledge the diversity in each of our students, understand their learning needs and in linguistic strength. As Lynn proposed, identity labels are used to stereotype privileged or marginalized readers and writers. Labels such as struggling, proficient, creative, or deviant, rather than seeing students' diversity as a barrier to learning, perhaps adopting pedagogy such as the translingual approach will support students to reshape their identity in a positive way.
Now let's come to the transnational literacy part. Transnational literacy is a literacy practice based on funds of knowledge, identities, and social relations rooted and extending across national borders. During the global pandemic, the transnational literacy is more broadly practiced due to the development of technology and people's dependency on online communication. There are 2 main effects produced by the practice of transnational literacy. On one hand, it forms the exchange of information or experience without the limits of various locations, social contexts, and languages through internet. For instance, scholars can know the latest finding or be inspired to new researches from relative studies conducted by other professionals. Due to the no borders of sharing knowledge, the scholars in the world world can work together like colleagues, which promotes the rapid development in their specific areas. On the other hand, a transformation from their original literacy practice can be found because of the influences received from the diversity of locations, social contexts, and the languages. In Chinese context, if a scholar wants to accumulate adequate academic prestige, they have to write their articles in English, and their work can be published in some well-known international journals. Therefore, it's inevitable that the use of language needs to transform from monolingual to multilingual. However, utilizing more than one language can influence the construct of their identity and relations with the languages, thoughts, and the bodies. In the meantime, the transformations are not only limited in those who use different languages, but also exist on native speakers when they communicate with non-native speakers, such as the use of language and the logic of speaking. In fact, I think the identity as international students, like who I am, can be an example for the practitioner of transnational literacy. I experienced the collision in thought from new educational pedagogy and theory, difference in cultural context and usage of language. However, it comes to the question that why we need to practice transnational literacy by becoming multilingual rather than translating the materials into our native languages. Firstly, it will waste too much time and effort for experts and translationers to translate the material, which will enormously reduce the spread speed of the information. More importantly, I believe everyone may meet the situation that one language cannot be perfectly translated into another. Translation distorts the context and the meaning of the material, which can dramatically improve if people can utilize the language which the writer originally used to write the paper. Therefore, the more efficient way of practicing transnational literacy is to promote the multilingual ability rather than highly dependent on translation. This idea is consistent with the policy carried on by Chinese education system in order to make students adapt to transnational literacy as much as possible. The teaching of foreign languages, mainly English, is involved in the 9 years compulsory education.
Now we come to the policy and literacy part. In the seminar of week 3, many students share their ideas about policy and illustrate how these policies influence their literary identity. In this section, I will first introduce the differences of postgraduate enrollment system between China and Australia, and then explain how this policy having impact on people's literary identity. The first difference is the procedure. In China, students need to sign up for the National Unified Examination, and they will have decided which university they want to go at that time. But in Australia, there is the application system, which means students can use the same materials to apply to several universities at the same time. In terms of content, Chinese university will emphasize the professional knowledge of a student, which is normally reflected on the score of the examination, while the Australian universities will value the comprehensive ability of a student to a higher extent. Therefore, the enrollment criterion of China is unitary and of Australian is diversified. By comparing the difference between my friend and I in preparing for a postgraduate program, I can see how the policy is shaping a person's literary identity. In preparing for the examination, my friend put more effort on her junior year. She searched for the information of specific schools, for example, the school requirements, required bibliography, and so on. After that, she had decided to sign up for a specific major in a certain school. And the following day, she prepared for the enrollment examination with a specific goal. Compared with my friend, I was not limited by one specific professional knowledge relatively. I can say my preparation for the postgraduate application is through my 4 years at university. I need to work hard to improve my GPA as high as possible, and for the IELTS test that Australian university required when I applied, I can take it many times and choose the greatest score to hand in. What's more, in the process of preparing for the application, I hadn't decided the major or even the school I want to go. I can use my GPA and IELTS score to apply to several universities at the same time. My personal experience shows how policy shapes people's literary identity as students. Students have different attention or goals according to different postgraduate enrollment systems. In one literacy or double power, Professor Joseph mentioned, policy literacy is not merely needed to interpret and understand what we are handed as policy by those who govern us. We need to be policy literate so that we can form coalition of interest between teachers and professional associations. Inspired by that, I think the ability to have good interaction with policy also an embodiment of literacy. Therefore, cultivation of policy literacy is very important not only for a policy performer, but also for the policymakers. We need to acknowledge the impact of policy on shaping people's literary identity and make good use of policy to achieve our personal and national goals. For each country's postgraduate enrollment system, there are always adjustments and improvements according to the social reality. Chinese policymakers keep learning the advanced practice from other enrollment systems and combine it with Chinese actual situation and contradictions. On the screen, we can see some suggestions for a Chinese postgraduate enrollment system. This practice aims to conducive to further improvement of our enrollment system so that it can be more perfect, more scientific, and more equitable to select the talent.
In this section, I'd like to discuss the utilization of literacy through the perspective of multimodality. According to Longstreet and Jensen, multimodal literacy uses various media to represent visual, gestural, audio, and spatial modes of communication, except written and oral forms. In addition to written and oral forms as basic modes for our communication, laptop screen that we're looking at, eye contact, facial expressions, and body language, music and video, even the online learning environment, are all different types of modes for our communication. From my personal experiences, the methods of communication and literacy are different between graduate school and middle school, which was around 10 years ago. In middle school, teachers were used to writing down lecture notes on the board, and assignments students submit were mostly handwritten based. And there also were no online student system like MyOnlyMap or learning management service like Canvas. But right now, teachers are teaching lectures through recording and Zoom meeting, and our assignments are submitted online via Canvas. And we also have smartphones, laptops, and so many technologies to create new forms and modes of communication and literacies. And these new technologies also transform methods of knowledge delivery. Multimodality is important under the pandemic situation. Before the pandemic, we adopted traditional face-to-face learning, which was processing learning information in person and creating closer interaction between educators and students. However, we're facing online learning during the pandemic. Our lectures are recorded as videos, and our tutorials are taken in the Zoom. And these changes alter the idea of literacy that we learn, and they also change the delivery of knowledge. According to the finding of Sharkey et al., online learning provides the flexibility of time and place on various platforms, which means students have opportunities to engage in a lecture from anywhere, such as laptops, smartphones, or computers, which are the kind of modes to deliver communication and literacy in online learning. Students can learn with speed and comfort according to their own volition through these new modes. This is also challenging for teachers and students, especially for online technologies. Teachers are required to be familiar with online learning, such as the usage of Zoom, Padlet, or other new modes of teaching. And students are forced to change their way of learning, and they also facing technology issue of online learning, and we require a lot of resources to achieve learning objectives. These new technologies create new modes of communication and change the way of how literacy is delivered. This is our group presentation, and we appreciate your attention.